And joining us now on the debate in Washington, D.C., Omer Ismail, advisor with the Enough Project. In Montreal, Quebec, Khalid Medani, professor of political science and Islamic studies at McGill University. And with us here in studio, John Schramm, Canada's former ambassador to Sudan. We're pleased to welcome all of you to the program today on something that this has been making big news in Africa. This is an historic referendum, and we're going to talk about it today. And John, I'm going to ask you to come in first and give us some of the background here for those who haven't been following this as carefully as you three have. Why was the referendum necessary in the first place?
Well, Steve, I'm sure that my Sudanese friends and guests here will have stronger and better opinions than mine, but I can speak as an outsider.
That's why I went to you first. I don't know what better, but they'll have different.
And I think that it was a price to pay. It was a price that the North was willing to pay, that the South was exacting for peace, for an end to very many years of irreconcilable differences, and certainly an immediate end to a very nasty conflict.
Okay, Khalid, why would you say that the referendum was called in the first place?
Well, it was called to end the civil war, that the last phase of the civil war in Sudan that lasted, from 1983 to 2005. And in 1983, a peace agreement between the North and the South broke down. It was called the Addis Ababa Peace Agreement. And beginning in 1983, the Southerners in particular had been calling and demanding for the right to self-determination, more equitable political representation in Khartoum, in the capital, and more equitable economic resource sharing, particularly oil, because it was discovered ironically in that year, in 1983. And so the negotiations began in 2002, and by 2005, the comprehensive peace agreement was signed between the northern government and the Sudan People's Liberation Movement. And within that comprehensive peace agreement, you had two very important stipulations. One of them was to convene democratic elections in 2009 to make, quote, unity attractive, unquote, to Southern Sudanese. That is, to give a final option for unity. And the other stipulation, of course, was the right to self-determination and the convening, the holding of a referendum, giving Southern Sudanese the right to self-determination and secession. After what was Africa's longest-running civil conflict, it's important to emphasize that the human cost to Southern Sudanese was immense. 2 million people killed, over 4 million displaced in the 22 years that the last phase of the civil war raged. And so that's really the origin of the peace agreement.
Okay, let me go to Omer on this. Why it is unusual around the world for the stronger, if I can put it that way, for the stronger part of the country to allow another part of the country to secede. We're seeing examples in Canada, for example, or in Spain, where that's often the case. Why do you think eventually the North, Sudan, allowed for a referendum, knowing full well that this would almost certainly mean the end of their country as they knew it?
Well, at the beginning, I very much doubt that they knew that it was the end of the country as they knew it. They signed the peace agreement under tremendous pressure from the international community. They thought that the 6 years transitional period is going to go on forever. They never thought that this day will come when they have to be forced to accept the secession of the South. However, the de facto situation on the ground has been that these are two separate countries in essence. This stipulation on the CPA was created actually to legalize a situation that has been there already. After the signing of the peace agreement, the South was autonomous. It ruled itself basically apart from Khartoum, and the majority of their decisions were in their hands in Juba, that is the capital of the South. The North never wanted this to happen, but maybe the NCP, the National Congress Party that is ruling in the North, had other plans for the South to secede, because they want any part of Sudan that they can call an Islamic country. Nonetheless, when they were signing the peace agreement, they knew that they are going to buy time. They are going to put all kinds of obstacles in the face of this country being the 54th country in Africa, but they were overpowered by tremendous pressure from the international community.
Well, they haven't, I guess, officially finished counting all the ballots, but so far it looks, John, as if 97.5% of the people are voting in favor of secession. Does it surprise you that it's that overwhelming?
No, it doesn't surprise me at all. As our colleagues have said from Washington, from Montreal, the history over the last 50 years, indeed since independence, since before independence, of the disagreements between the North and the South, the sense that the North see themselves as an elite who have every right to exploit, to push around, if you want, to go that far. The people of the South have left a very bitter feeling. Now, it's not a foregone conclusion, as Omar said, because as late as the peace agreement, when the South was led by a very well-respected man, Dr. John Garang, it was quite possible, and he had kept his options open, that Sudan might stay together in a federal or some other system of government. But in the last run-up to this referendum, I think the sheer emotion, the sense of relief at finally having a way out of this conflict, and as I said earlier, irreconcilable differences of the last 50 years, pretty well predicted that people would, of course, vote for secession.
Well, we know how they feel in the South, Khalid, but can you tell us how the referendum results are being regarded in the North?
Well, it's very controversial in the North. I mean, there are two different perspectives. Of course, the government and its supporters have decided to go ahead and approve and see the referendum through and the partition. But as you can imagine, there are many political forces and civil society forces in the North that are using it as a way to undermine or oppose the present regime. Just a couple of days ago, one of the big opposition political leaders, Hassan Turabi, was put in prison or under house arrest because he called for kind of an uprising, so to speak, against this government, a government that had ceded away a large part of the country. And so on one level, there are some who are not too much kind of disturbed that the South is going to be partitioned, but there are many others in the North, because it's a non-democratic system, a regime in the North. Many others in the North are using it as a way, a political kind of chip, so to speak, to wage a protest against this present regime. So there are two minds. Now, I do want to highlight that there are millions of Southern Sudanese in the North as well, and their status in terms of citizenship in the North, or whether they actually will be going down to the South, to the new South Sudan, so to speak, that also is a source of tension.
Do you think their safety is in jeopardy right now, Khalid?
I think it depends, I think that it's a risk. It's something to take very seriously, because the issue of citizenship for those Southerners in the North has not been worked out. And there have been people in the government, well-placed ministers in the government in Khartoum, who have said that they are willing, or want to rather, deny full citizenship rights to those Southerners in the North. And what we know is that very few Southern Sudanese living in the North actually registered to vote for the referendum, most likely because they were concerned about the risk of being known, so to speak, with respect to the Northern government. So their kind of vote has not really been registered. They were kind of afraid, basically, to register and to vote for the referendum. And frankly, although the referendum has gone very peacefully, and that's a very positive development, we do know that there were skirmishes. At least 75 people in the border areas between North and South were killed, in inter-tribal clashes. And so there are warning signs to take seriously.
Let me figure out now, John, what has to happen. Okay, the results will be ratified, I gather, on Valentine's Day, February 14th. It seems abundantly clear right now what the results are going to be. It is going to be a vote for secession. What then takes place to see that this new entity, Southern Sudan or whatever they're going to call it, becomes a real country?
Well, I wonder if our friends would agree with me. My thought is that this is just the beginning. We've seen often in elections in other African countries where I've seen people filing peacefully through polling booths, that the day of the election itself, the aftermath of the election indeed, can go very well indeed. What happens next is what's important, and of course what happens next in this situation is that there's a long period, 6 months of negotiations. Negotiations are the very problems that Khalid has been referring to here. negotiations over the frontier, over the security, over citizenship,
Oil.
what happens to the people in the north, and most importantly, you've hit it right on the nose, oil. How do we divide up the oil revenues?
Because most of the oil is going to be in the south.
It's
revenues are gonna be in the
somebody
south?
told me, our friends would know better, but I think about 85% of it is in the south, and so the only pipeline runs through the north. The North has been very good, it seems so far, in saying that we'll divide this up, but these negotiations are going to be very tough because they have to produce, in order for there to be peace, something that both sides feel that they've gained their basic objectives.
Omar Ismail, can I get you to pick up on that? Now that the referendum appears overwhelmingly to be going one way as opposed to the other, what then has to happen for Southern Sudan to become a real country?
Yes, I agree with Ambassador that the voting can be peaceful and people are jubilant in Juba and elsewhere. They are very happy for you know what they have achieved. However, by the time we certify the votes and declare the results by February 14th, then that is another issue altogether. And from there up to around July 9th, when the end of the transitional period, and that is the last station for the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. From that time, it is expired. This is where both the Sudanese in the north and in the south have to work hard to settle issues like Abyei, an area that is in the border where the Ngok Dinka of Abyei give way to the Masiriya Arabs of the north, who are coming with their cattle every dry season going south into the southern region for looking for grazing land and water. That is one contentious point of 2,200-kilometer border, which is going to remain still the longest border between any two countries in Africa. That border is porous. A lot of people are talking about whether it is going to be a hard border or a soft border. We will see. The negotiations will determine that. The citizenship, as Khalid was talking about, there is talk in Khartoum today that by the day that they declare the results or announce the results, that the Southerners overwhelmingly voted for secession. The people in the north, the Southerners in the north, will be stripped of their citizenship. I don't know how that could happen in a place where these people are born and raised, and they are people officials in the government of Sudan today who are running this country, who are citizens of both countries where we are talking now, with Canada and the United States. And they enjoy dual citizenship, and they want to deprive their own citizens from that. I don't understand it. And also the issue of oil, which is 80% of the tapped oil is going to be in southern Sudan now. The pipeline is running through the north. How are they going to share that? Is the South going to transport the oil and they are going to pay fees for transporting it? Is Khartoum going to insist that they have oil and they control physical areas in the South? The Norwegians have their work cut out for them because they are the ones who are trying to make that deal between the two parties. How about the currency? How about the other issues pertaining to the debt? Sudan enjoys about between 35 to 40 billion dollars of debt, depending on who you're talking to. How are they going to divide that? It is all going to be the responsibility of the North, or the South is going to chip in. If the South was the new country that everybody is sympathetic with, and they want to forgo that debt for the South, would the North feel left out and punished because its debt is not going to be relieved?
It sounds to me like you have put your finger on a myriad of issues that they're going to have to figure out by the time they get this new country together. I also want to introduce now and thank him for joining our discussion in our nation's capital, Houston Laku, who is the founder of a group called the Friends of Sudan. And Houston, as I welcome you to the program, I want to ask you right off the top, you went back to Sudan to vote in the referendum, right? Tell me about what that experience was like.
It is a constitutional right. It is part of the duty that I have to do because of my grandfather, my father, and many others who fought for the freedom that I haven't experienced myself, born as a refugee in Uganda, and then live as a refugee for the second time in Cairo, Egypt, and then ended up a refugee in Canada. However, It is a very good experience because I get to participate, and it's a history for my grandchildren and for the next generation to come.
Houston, were you satisfied that it was a clean vote?
Absolutely, it was a clean vote. I was there traveling from city to the city. There's no any issues to do with the irregularity, rigging, or whatsoever.
You were not pressured one way or another in which way to cast your ballot?
Not absolutely. The people, you see, people of the Southern Sudan, I want to remind you, there's a person, one of the freedom fighters, his name is Agre Jaden. In 1947, when things went wrong before the independence, he said the future of the Southern Sudanese will be determined by the next generation to come. And we did exactly that.
Because sometimes, you know, when we hear that one side got 97.5% of the vote, the first thing that popped into my head was those are the kind of numbers Saddam Hussein used to get when he held elections in Iraq. And he got them for one reason and one reason only, and that was because he threatened people if they went the other way. None of that went on this time. You're confident of that?
No, because you see, we have experienced the reality, the distrust. Let me just, I think the question needed to be asked, can we be able to avoid the referendum? Yes, it could be. If the Khartoum government in Navasha have removed out the Islamic State and they removed the religion from the state, because the SPLA have tabled the secular state, that to be in the New Sudan. But the NCP refused. They say they would like to stick on the Islamic State and the identity of the Sudan, which is an Arab state. And therefore, the referendum factor in.
Okay.
And the idea of the separation is not new because it was already been proposed in 1947 for the federalism. It failed.
Understood.
And then again, one thing that we need to bear in mind that the people in the South have already knew very well that the Khartoum government cannot be trusted because from the previous experiences from the leaders like Numeri, he said once that let's sign the agreement with the rebels. Once they come in, we'll disarm them. Once we disarm them, and then we can throw the agreement into the can basket, to the trash. So, but John Garang this time makes sure that he is in control of his army because he refused for the army to be incorporated in the national army. So that gives him the power to actually achieve this referendum.
Okay, let me get our guest right now to start considering what kind of country this new Southern Sudan will be if and when it eventually becomes, in fact, a country. And John, I'll get you to comment first. And to do so, I want to read this quote from Time magazine last spring, which really asks a very penetrating question. How can Southern Sudan become an independent nation when it possesses so little of what defines one? Many aid workers and development experts in Juba doubt it can. They have coined a new term to describe its unique status, a pre-failed state. That seems like a good question to ask. How can Southern Sudan become an independent nation when it possesses so little of what a country needs to become one?
Well, it's a good question for Canadians to be considering right now because the answer to the question is, with the right support, it can do it very well. There are Sudanese people, both, as we've just seen, both out of the country. I read some large figure of something like 40,000 Sudanese, north and south in Canada, but 2,200 actually voted, which means they were from the south. These are educated people. They're people who've had good education living abroad. There are people there who have. What they need is infrastructure. What they need is support to rebuild hospitals, schools, the things that have been destroyed in the war, things that were never there in the first place because they've been deprived of that type of thing. So I see it as up to Canada, as up to the international community to make sure that this does work. It's no worse off than many countries were at independence, and I think it can be done. I'm quite optimistic.
Khalid, this country is coming off of a terrible civil war. 70% of the people are under the age of 30. There is incredible poverty, the likes of which we can't even appreciate here. Not to mention, you know, allegations of genocide and so on. How does a country like that, you know, make its way in the world?
Well, first of all, we have to be clear about one thing that, with all due respect, in terms of one of the previous speakers, neither the North nor the South are homogeneous ethnically or politically. And that's something to really keep in mind. So the first issue has to do with the issue of for lack of a better term, good governance, some form of democratization. The northern government is non-democratic. and that it does not allow for any kind of freedom of expression. Right now we have a protest going on sporadically in the north, and the same can be said for the south, that it is a very large territory, as you know, the size of France. It contains a multiplicity of different ethnic groups as well. That is, the positive development of the referendum should not overshadow what needs to be done in the future. And two problems arise in South Sudan. One of them is that it's landlocked and requires very close relations with the northern Sudan and northern government. Another thing which I think is very important is the oil itself. 80% of the oil or the government budget of, if not more, of southern Sudan is going to come from oil. And we know, frankly, from other experiences, that this can actually lead to less development or skewed development, so to speak, and also a concentration of both economic wealth and political power at the very top in a region that is very much in need of a larger investment in infrastructure. So I agree with your previous speaker that South Sudan actually doesn't need a financial aid, but what it does need is technological aid, investment in infrastructure, in education, improving the kind of manpower and skills of Southern Sudanese.
And let me follow up with Omar Ismail, if I can, on this angle, since the previous speakers mentioned the fact that politically in the South, they are not as unified as perhaps we think. How dangerous is that right now, Omar Ismail, the fact that there is not this kind of unified political voice in the South that perhaps a new country would want to have?
I love my friends and brothers and sisters in the South. However, we have a proverb in Sudan that they are well aware of, that we say, listen to those who make you cry and don't listen to those who make you laugh. We have to be candid about advising the South on avoiding all the issues that it historically had. After the Addis Ababa agreement came to an end, when Nimeri decided to divide the southern region again to 3 regions, we have seen the bitterness that was between some of the dominant ethnic groups and the lesser ethnic groups in terms of size in the south. And a lot of people remember that. However, a country the size of France, like Khalid was saying, I had the privilege of going there after the signing of the peace agreement, and I worked and I traveled extensively in southern Sudan. I've seen the poverty, I've seen the destruction. Yes, Mr. Ambassador, we can bring in 3,000 or more people from the South who were educated outside of the country. I have learned somewhere that the Democratic Republic of Congo, when it came to independence in the early 60s of the past century, there were less than 10 graduates of all the Congo. But the Belgians left behind a country that was functioning and running. It is the second largest country after Sudan in Africa. But these growing pains that plagued Congo, we've seen the result of it later. And after 50 years, Congo is still in a war within itself, and it cannot go anywhere. So I have seen a lot of my brothers and sisters who came from outside, but they came by themselves. Now they are ministers in the government of South Sudan today. None of them had their families in Sudan. They are all in Australia and Canada, United States and elsewhere, because it is not feasible that I will take my 12-year-old and 10-year-old to Sudan where they don't have a school and they don't have a hospital.
Understood, but let me get Houston's view on this.
It takes a lot to do that.
Houston, do you think that, I mean, you were there very recently for the vote. Did you see anything, anything resembling the kind of infrastructure you need to start a country? Anything like the institutions you need to start a country? Does any of that exist today?
Actually, yes. One thing, you don't have to have everything 100%. If you do remember when Germany was destroyed in the Second World War, they started from the scratch. Look at Japan. When Japan was destroyed, and Hitler said he doesn't need any aid from the foreigners, but let the Japanese people work hard to be a self-reliance.
Well, yes, but so Houston, there was something called the Marshall Plan. I mean, the rest of the world chipped in to rebuild those countries.
Yes.
I don't see that in the offing here.
No,
Am I wrong?
No. It is South Sudan. Actually, Sudan as a whole is very rich. What we need to do is to kind of capitalize on what we have. What can we be able to increase to avoid the poverty, to avoid this failing state? Instead of us drumming or kind of beating the drum that's going to be a failing state, we should look how can we prevent this failing state should not come. This is the question that we need to actually look at. For instance, we can support in terms of the refugee, in terms of the good policy in the agriculture, good policy in education, a transfer of knowledge from the diaspora or from the technological countries, so that this new country, when it's going to be built, is going to be built up with the support of the whole international community. But what is happening now, the NGOs is saying it's a failing state, it's a failing state, so what do you want to do about it? That's the question we need to do.
Okay, let me put that to John Schramm. Do you see evidence that there's a Marshall Plan waiting in the wings to come in here to help rebuild this country?
I would not say a Marshall Plan, but I know that in Canada we have the Sudan Task Force. This is just one country, but we've been involved with the North-South conflict in Sudan, with Sudan for a long time. We do a lot in Sudan. Canadians would be surprised to know how much we actually do there. Everything from military advice to police advice to large sums of humanitarian assistance and development aid. We'll have to beef that up, and I have no doubt that we'll come under a great deal of pressure, both from some Canadians to do so, but also from our allies, the United States in particular. This issue is important to Americans, to the American administration. President Obama has made that very clear. So there will be pressure for us. Same thing, there are other countries that have taken a long interest in this, Britain, France and Germany, Norway in particular. And if we all work together, if we respond together, it may not be a Marshall Plan proportions, but this, I believe, this is a situation that we must make work, that Southern Sudan must make work, and with the cooperation of the North, and as peculiar as that might sound to some of our guests, I believe we can make that work. It can be done.
Khalid, John gave a long list of countries there, but one he did not mention was China. And China's been very actively, as we know, very actively involved in Sudan. Do you have any idea about the kind of relationship they will have or want to establish with Southern Sudan?
Well, they're going to have to establish a very strong relationship with Southern Sudan because the majority of oil is going to actually be in Southern Sudan now, in the new Southern Sudan. That's very, very important. I think that one proposal that's being put forward is to have kind of a joint structure for the distribution of oil, because the majority of oil may be in the south, but as my colleague said, of course, the pipeline goes through the north. And for stability and security, which is the cornerstone of any kind of development for South Sudan or in the north, it's very important to have a framework, a joint structure that brings in China, the European Union, Canadians, and others to help in terms of redistributing this oil more equally, and within South Sudan to make sure that the oil is distributed more fairly, more equitably. That's extremely important. In other words, use that kind of revenue in order to invest in this new state much more equitably, and that's very important. I think because of the amount of oil that is in South Sudan, China has a great incentive to join this kind of framework that includes not only international actors, but also the Northern Sudanese government. And I think there's already a proposal on the table by the EU to work that out. So China's role is going to be very important in South Sudan. It continues to invest in exploration in Northern Sudan and in Southern Darfur. And so it has a great deal of interest and investment, and it has to actually be brought in, because oil is going to be a very, very important factor with respect to the stability of what everyone is talking about, and that is post-referendum arrangements.
Right. Okay, Omar Ismail, let me ask you about the neighborhood. And as I do that, I want to read from, well, this guy is one of the most profound advocates on behalf of poor people around the world, Paul Collier, who wrote that book, The Bottom Billion. And here's a paragraph from that book. All landlocked countries are by definition surrounded by neighbors. Unfortunately, some neighbors are better as markets than others. Switzerland has Germany, Italy, France, and Austria. Uganda has Kenya, which has been stagnant for nearly 3 decades. Sudan, which has been embroiled in civil war. Rwanda, which had a genocide. Somalia, which completely collapsed. The Democratic Republic of Congo, the history of which was sufficiently catastrophic for it to change its name from Zaire. All of which makes me wonder, Omar Ismail, whether or not the neighborhood is sufficiently bad around the new country of Southern Sudan as, once again, to be another reason why this country may have an enormous amount of difficulty getting off the ground. What do you think?
Thank you very much. Mr. Collier put his finger on it. As much as we wish for this country to be the country that we wanted, and we will all work hard to make it the country that the people are aspiring to. I think we have to be careful about our expectations, and we have to tame down some of the notorious expectations that the international community are going to come in and then build this country from scratch. The Republicans walked into town yesterday. I was testifying in the U.S. Congress, and they are one of the congressmen was questioning, why do we have to spend $10 billion in Sudan since this peace agreement and let China take all the oil and go away with it? They are coming in and they are already calling for cutting off foreign aid to many of the countries. So the neighborhood is very important. We've seen what happened in several countries that you just mentioned. Many of these countries supported the armed struggle in the South when the South was going through this. But when it came to the fact that it is going to be a country that is going to secede from the mother country, Sudan, everybody is now skeptical. Idris Deby of Chad last year was saying, I have the same situation in Chad. Chad has its south too. There are Christians, there are people who are, talking about the lack of development in their part. The Oromos in Kenya, in Ethiopia. There is the history of Katanga in the Congo. There is the history of Biafra in Nigeria, and so on and so forth.
Actually, this is all important. I want to follow up on this if I can with John here for a second. Let me follow up with John because, when they drew all these arbitrary lines on a map at the end of World War I and created these countries seemingly with little thought at all to the ethnic groups that were going to make them up, the conventional wisdom has always been you can't mess with the borders. Once you do, it's the thin edge of the wedge. Well, they're messing with the borders here. What kind of, is this the thin edge of the wedge? Are we going to start to see other countries as well demanding that, chunks of their countries be taken out and created into new countries?
Well, I have two things to say. One is rather positive, and that is that the young generation, what one of the famous development authors writes about, a Ghanaian, in fact, by the name of George Aiti, the cheetah generation, if you want, think that, yes, we were stuck with a bad deal with the Congress of Berlin and the borders, but that was 50 years ago. We've got to get on with what we've got. And younger people seem to recognize that there's a future, even in the countries that are there. Second thing, though, to say is, of course, there are pressures. Omar is quite right. There are pressures all over Africa to shift borders according to ethnic and religious, perhaps, entities. But the fact is that this country has been, for 50 years, in the grip of a civil war, which, as someone rightly said earlier, has claimed 2 million lives just in the last segment of that war. Well, that's quite a price to pay, and I don't think that sets a precedent. That doesn't set a precedent, to me anyway, that would say that other countries who have been working on this issue for 50 years should suddenly decide that they're going to split in two.
Khalid, let me get your view on how strong you think the arguments are across Africa to create new countries where there are ethnic tensions.
I think there are some arguments that, whether it's Ivory Coast or Nigeria, but not only Africa, the Kurds in northern Iraq have spoken to me personally, actually, about wanting to replicate the Sudan experiment. But I think the African Union and the majority of Africans continue to really hold very dear the sacred aspect of these borders. They are artificial, but what nation, what state is not artificial in Africa and elsewhere? And the consequences of this domino effect of other countries using Sudan as an example to partition their populations, I think is going to be very, very negative. And I think what people who are interested in that kind of precedent or the Sudan should realize is, just as my colleague said, that the severity and the sheer length of the war in Sudan made this inevitable in some ways, but also it has been a result of a long process of negotiations. A peace agreement an initial one that lasted 11 years and then broke down, and then long sustained negotiations between North and South and the international community. In other words, in the Sudan case, this was a very much a final option when all other efforts have tried. And one effort that failed, unfortunately for the Sudan case, was democratization, that I'd really like to emphasize. Because in our discussions, I think you mentioned Collier and his discussion of landlocked countries and bad neighbors. But I think he also emphasizes, and many others do, the importance of good governance in terms of countries like South Sudan. And one of the stipulations of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was to convene democratic elections. And frankly, I don't believe the international community supported those elections as much as they could have. Eventually, the majority of parties boycotted that, and it made secession, partition inevitable. So the first step that other Africans should really discuss in the African continent, and they are discussing, is actually a move towards more accountable governance, more political representation.
Okay. Let me jump in here if I can, Khalid, because I've got a minute and a half to go, and I want to put this to Houston, because you're the guy who went back to vote. And I want to know, if we look 10 years down the road, what do you think we're going to see in this new Southern Sudan?
You will see there is a hope. And I would like to say that I hope the leaders of the SPLM will not repeat or transfer Khartoum to the south. What it means is try to do the same thing that the Khartoum government was doing before. That would be the one danger here that I would see. If we want to see the country to go forward 10 years from now to be a better country, to be a better example in the African continent. And the other thing also I would like to bring into attention that we need to kind of work very hard to make sure that to prevent any other issues that will lead us to the failing states. Three, also I would like to see that the support from the international community to come in to make sure that to work with the Sudanese locals and the diaspora to make sure that the democracy is applied as it is according to the African tradition, because what is happening in Africa today, it is we have a copy-paste of the Western democracy that we bring in from the West. We never understand the mechanism behind it, and then we try to apply in order to get a financial aid from the Western countries.
Okay,
and never work in Africa.
I'm going to stop you there because we still want to talk about Cote d'Ivoire on this program as well. But let me thank everybody for participating in our discussion tonight. Omer Ismail from the Enough Project in Washington, D.C., Khalid Madani, McGill University out of our studios in Montreal, Houston Laku, Friends of Sudan in our studios in the nation's capital, and our former ambassador to Sudan, John Schramm, here in our Toronto studios. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate your participation.
Thank you.